Welcome to the last, some noise. Welcome to the last session of this year's PASS Summit. As I just mentioned, I am very, very happy that you found your way at this point in time to this room. I'm happy to have you here. I was actually afraid it might be less. I'm very, very positively surprised and very proud that you think me as a worthy final of this summit, or my session. But yeah, what I want to talk about is, well, continuous intelligence is the wording. Let me make this a little bit more clear during the next 75 minutes, what I actually mean by this. I'll be very happy to receive any kind of feedback if the abstract was actually making this clear before. From some of the conversations we already had, I'm positive it was. I hope so. And yeah, while talking about feedback, I don't care about cell phones, but of course, PASS is the reason that we are all here. They made this work, they made this possible. I'm pretty sure you are aware of PASS and what PASS has to offer. But again, it always or sometimes pays just to have another look at what there might be available at PASS. Sometimes it's really cool things you can see. And we are actually working for PASS Germany or engaged with PASS Germany a lot. And it's always a pleasure to create new things, to deliver things, to talk to people. And I think that's what all this is about, being a community, talking to each other, sharing knowledge. And yeah. My name is Gabi Münster, as probably the accent already tells. I'm from Germany. And I'm a team lead for data analytics in a small or medium-sized company called OH22. You will get, or the slides actually are available on the homepage. I actually made some slide or larger changes to the slide deck just this morning. I actually didn't look if already the most recent version is available. I will definitely send out a tweet as soon as I get the confirmation that the most recent version is available on the homepage. So if you already downloaded the slides, look for the tweet. If you didn't and you want to have the slides, wait for the tweet, just to make sure. And I'm working with SQL Server technologies for more than 10 years now. I started working with analysis services multidimensional. This is still the product of my heart. I really love it. I got used to Tabular. I'm working with Power BI, MDS, more or less whatever is necessary. But actually, my first part of my IT career was working as a web application developer. And that probably had a slight influence on me choosing that topic and actually starting to consider that topic a few years ago. Oh, and I'm a data platform MVP. Well, just as a quick overview, who of you is not working with BI? Okay, who of you is not familiar with analysis services? Perfect, that's what I expected and hoped for. So I quickly try to cover the topic of continuous integration. And while I'm talking about continuous integration, the session title actually was talking about continuous intelligence. I will also actually talk about why it shows that wording and what the difference is. And then, well, who of you is familiar with continuous integration? Okay, so, but talking a little bit more about the background maybe is not a bad thing. And then my special topic, why is continuous integration actually not that big topic in BIs yet, or just starting to get an important topic? So the reason is challenges, of course. And what are those challenges that BI is actually offering for continuous integration processes? And then, of course, after discussing this, we will offer something like a general approach, how we are setting up continuous integration processes in BI projects. And I will try to make let's say, at least a reasonable overview of what you can easily do with one of the tools. It's not actually, and I will say this at the beginning, we cannot run from A to Z in a 70-minute session with demos. That's just not possible. But I try to cover as much as possible and show some approaches. And if there are any questions, please feel free to ask during the session or at the end of the session. I'm trying to cover as much as possible. Otherwise, also, you can ever write me an email or drop me a message at LinkedIn or whatever. I'm happy to answer questions, and so please feel free. Okay, yeah, as I mentioned, why continuous intelligence instead of continuous integration? If you're looking up continuous intelligence, mostly you get the definition that this is a machine-driven automated process to actually gather information out of data. So something like automated BI, maybe automated analytics, which sounds like an interesting approach. Probably if that would actually happen as well, some of us would have less to do. If I still would get the same amount of money, I wouldn't mind that much, but well, that's another topic. But what I think is, well, we are real life people. We know ideas like that, but we know that there is a long way to get there if we ever get there. And one of the things that we actually would need to achieve something like that is a stable process in the beginning that actually allows a machine-driven automated process to start self-learning, to start improving, to have a really stable and sound baseline it's actually starting from. And what is that actually what I'm talking about? It's a good BI project. That's what we need in the beginning. Without good definitions, a good project at the start, something like this definition of continuous intelligence will never happen. And well, this leads me to something which I'm really interested in, which is a working, stable BI project. And there we have another factor of automation that could be interesting to us, which is automation of testing, automation of delivery, things that actually can help us improve the stability and the quality of our BI project. And that is what is actually meant by continuous integration for business intelligence, or in short, continuous intelligence. So I actually captured the phrase. So, but well, continuous integration, what is this actually all about? As I mentioned, I started my IT career as a web application developer. And in the classical application development, continuous integration was actually more kind of a topic when I worked there quite a long time ago. But I was used to that. And the actual intention was to prevent problems caused by merging different development versions into one version by detecting errors as soon as possible by running automated tests, and by this to enable the developers to actually work on those errors, to prevent errors as much as possible, to guarantee stability, to improve the quality, and to actually, and that's most important to all decision makers who are talking about, this is so expensive, to reduce cost. Because finding out, detecting errors, especially if we detect them too late and they appear at the customer, is something which causes a lot of costs. The later you detect an error, the harder, the more effort you need to get it out of the system. And the more complex a system gets, the more side effects any kind of change can have onto the whole system, the more necessary it becomes to actually have something like a stable process of evaluating the functionality of the system, to ensure that not only your new developments are actually proper and sound, but that they don't have any negative effect on your already running system. And that is actually what continuous integration is all about. And continuous integration is like some other words used in several meanings. So it is very often used as a synonym for the complete process, starting from actually merging or storing the source code, merging changes, running unit tests up to actually deploying to production. But what it actually is the first step of this complete process. So when we're looking at the whole process, we are starting with continuous integration, which is actually performing the first or covering the first 3 steps I was talking about. So first of all, we will start with source code control. We will store and version our source code to actually have the possibility to easily detect what has been changed during development between 2 versions. We want to build those versions to actually ensure that they are stable from an actual code basis, from a code perspective. And we want to have the possibility to run tests on top. Unit test means we actually run small tests, just testing a certain piece of functionality or an actual requirement we have in regards to the code. This can also be something like, are we following naming conventions or something like this? But we are really concentrating on a certain piece of functionality or requirement and are testing this. The next step in the process is actually continuous delivery. This, of course, covers the first 3 steps we just discussed, but it adds the deployment to our test environment, where we can, first of all, perform integration tests, which should be something which needs, or in the perfect world, should be automated as well. So that is something where we definitely will talk about in more details. But this is actually being the baseline, a stable quality or test system that allows, for example, our QA department to run their own tests, to actually do the manual, the user tests, and gather if the new development is correct. And after that, we can even go 1 step further and apply continuous deployment, which also covers the part of deploying the changes to production. In most of the cases, this requires an approval step in between, so it's not really like this is an automated process running and you don't have any kind of influence. But in most of the cases, it's actually, for example, your QA department that is saying, we run all our tests, everything looks perfect, we agreed with the customer on a migration date, push the button, now you can run. I never saw a full continuous deployment process in any BI project. Might be feasible, I never saw it. It happens in application development, but I'd be perfectly happy to see at least continuous delivery in all BI projects I'd be working on. Okay, I'd be happy if I see continuous integration in all BI projects I'd be working on, but continuous delivery would be great. Any questions so far? Yeah, this is just actually in written down what I just told you, but I thought when you get the handout, or if you're interested in the slides, you should be able to remember some of the many words I will probably utter during the next few minutes. But some additional terms we probably should talk about when we're talking this. Well, maybe another thing about the background. I started working with continuous integration in BI about 5 years ago. As I mentioned, I'm coming from Germany. At that point in time, when I asked BI developers, do you know what continuous integration is? Maybe 1 out of 30 would raise their hand and say yes. Did you ever consider this for a BI project? Nobody. It changed a little bit, but in this regard, Germany is still way behind. When you're going to other European countries, you see a completely different perception, and it's getting better and better. And that I am here allowed to talk to you at a past summit, and that there even was another session about that topic even today, actually shows to me that times are getting better for us. And I'm looking forward to be part of that times. But still, to me, it seems like this is something which needs to be mentioned more, and which is still not something which everybody is familiar with. That is why I think we need to find common terminology we talk about. So the first word that is used in continuous integration is something you probably knew from any kind of ETL. We're talking about a pipeline. A pipeline is nothing else than you know from, I don't know, Azure Data Factory, for example. It is storing information about a process that has to be done. So you can put jobs inside, you can put some prerequisites inside, something like this. So it's a combination of all steps that need to be implemented or need to be executed to achieve a certain result. Then we need agents. I don't know how is it here. In Germany, we really like references to any kind of films we liked. So Agent, the first film I could think about was Matrix. But Agent Smith is something completely different than the agent we are talking about here. So the agent is actually doing the work, performing the work. So this is the piece of software that is actually executing the pipeline that you just defined before. And agents can be organized in agent pools. That means you have the possibility to actually decide how large your environment gets, how much parallelism you actually want to apply onto this, how many jobs you have to run in, and so on. And artifacts is also nothing from Indiana Jones. We're not talking about crystal skulls or anything, but we're talking about the results of your pipeline. So the deliverables that are actually generated. So when you're thinking about a build process, for example, when you're running a build in Visual Studio, the result will be with analysis service a .as database file, for example. Something which you can use in your further process as the basis for a deployment, for example. And this is something which is absolutely necessary inside this process. And the last step is the repository. Probably all of you are familiar with source code repositories, which is the first element that is actually used, or the typical element that is actually used. But apart from this, there is another kind of repository in CI/CD processes that can be of any relevance. It's not absolutely required, but it can be interesting, and that is an artifact repository. This actually allows you to store the artifacts, the deliverables out of your process into a repository, which also allows you to version, to store, to actually apply the artifacts with additional meta information if you want to. Especially if you want to perform things like running releases onto different environments, for example, it might be useful to store your build artifacts in an artifact repository to have them at hand whenever you want, and to have also the information from which build they are actually originating, and so on. There are some best practices for continuous integration. So maintaining a code repository we actually talked about. Who is maintaining a source code repository for your BI projects? Okay, not all of you, but many. When I started in BI about 10, 12 years ago, it was almost nobody doing that, which was quite interesting. Okay, deployment was connecting to multidimensional life and deploying the MDX script, so this was also always very interesting, but this changed over time, and this is good. Well, I have this discussion each and every time. There are reasons, or there are situations where you might live without a source code repository, but it's something, and this is actually the most important reason for me to cover this topic, it's something which helps me sleep better. It guarantees that I can actually find previous versions, that I can check previous versions, that I can identify changes I performed or anybody else in my team performed. I have the possibility to go back to a certain version. This is just something which helps me cover urgent situations, crises much better, because it gives me something I can rely on. And that is my main reason for using a code repository. We were talking about building a project. This is something which should be automated if possible, and the build of a project should be fast. And the perfect situation is whenever you commit a change to the baseline, this change should be built, which means whenever you check in something, you should get an immediate or almost immediate result if this check-in breaks something. Because if that's the case, you should see it immediately, because then hopefully you still remember what you did. That makes it easy to change it. If you get that information 2 months later, you probably need some time to actually recap what you did during that change. And maybe there have been other implementations done in the meantime, which can make it quite complicated to actually detect the error and to really remove it from the system. Automated or test automation is another thing which is really helpful, because, as I mentioned, the more complex a project gets, the more side effects every change can have. So when you have a set of tests that you can run each and every time again, this can help you to guarantee that new changes are not affecting the existing situation, because all the tests that were successful before have to be successful again after each and every change. Apart from when you intentionally change something, of course, but this is also something which you can cover by automated tests. The ideal situation, again, would be to perform the tests in a clone of the production environment. If you're in the lucky situation to do that, congratulations. I envy you, but, well, that's the best practice. Another thing is to make it easy to get the latest deliverables. This is talking about artifacts, but this is also talking about results. For example, results of test runs. So if you are performing your test runs and something fails, which you didn't expect to fail, this should be transparent. You shouldn't need to search for it. It should be obvious. And actually, everybody should see it. And this is one of the points where normally we start with some discussions, because when you're telling this to decision makers who are not aware with IT development or BI development, some of them say, that's perfect, then I can see how good my developers are working. That's not what it's meant for. It should help you to improve your work, that's true, but that means it should help you to identify errors earlier. Nothing, whatever we do, can prevent us from doing errors. That's what, well, we're developers. We're not perfect, we shouldn't be. And when we try things out, then errors can happen. But the easier those errors are identified, the less impact they have. And that's the important thing. It's nothing about blaming anybody. And that is something which needs to be actually made clear from the start, because otherwise this will only lead to some kind of antipathy against the whole project, and that doesn't make any kind of sense. And the last step is automating the deployment. That is what continuous delivery is all about. Questions? Cool. So that's what continuous integration is about. So challenges for BI. Can you think about, well, let's go back to the best practices. Can you think about anything which, thank you. Yes, so the first answer was automating tests. Well, we will look into this, and yes, there are challenges for tests, but maybe the biggest challenge is not automating them, but actually designing them. This is one thing which might be hard, because if you have a test tool, and if you design your tests, the automation is something which is done by the CI/CD tool. So that's easy, but designing tests in BI is definitely a topic we need to talk about. Yes. Yes. So quickly speaking, it's a lot of work and it's quite complex. And that's the case. Other topics that might be hard to do? Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So this actually relates to BI projects are not treated like code projects most of the time, so there is no real possibility to compare versions and to merge versions. So it's parallel work is almost impossible, but if you do parallel work, then it's mostly a nightmare. Yeah. Yes, please. Okay, so Power BI is a special topic. I actually have, my last slide will talk about Power BI a bit, but Power BI definitely is special. But not only for Power BI, deployment automation is also something which is quite complicated sometimes because tool support is not as normal as it is for normal code projects. And with Power BI especially, there is still less support because Power BI still is coming from a self-service approach, and it wasn't meant to be an enterprise-ready tool in the beginning, and things are starting to get changed, but if you already have a code basis that doesn't allow for it, it's hard to patch this afterwards. Okay. All valid points, all points I have. I will just continue because otherwise I have to look up which slides I actually have to skip already. But yes, all of those points are very important points. And maybe just as a quick start, but this sounds different sometimes, I'm sorry. What we actually were talking about is some of the specifics of BI projects, and let's maybe summarize them first. What we didn't talk about yet is, apart from even the complexity you have, for example, to write tests for analysis services, because the product itself is already allowing for so much complexity. A whole BI landscape is so complex. When I moved over from web application development, I was used to the good old 3-tier layer applications. Front end, business layer, data access layer. When I look at a BI project, it looks more or less the same. Front end, business application, analysis services, for example, data access layer, database, some ETL in between. I never know if it's actually business logic or something completely special, but well, it's relatively similar. But what is the difference? Each layer probably has a different technology, or several different technologies included. So when you're setting up integration tests over the complete landscape, you have to take care about all those different technologies. And talking about data integration, a lot of applications are generating the data on their own. They have this one application database you're talking about. Talking about a BI project, where do you get your test data from all your source systems? How to do that? Actually, I prefer BI projects where you don't have test versions of your source systems, because when you have test versions of your source systems, the data therein is mostly crap. There's nothing you can really test with. This is really, alone talking about this is making continuous integration for BI a nightmare. This is really complex. But then we talked about the data models, those XML-based or those XML-based Microsoft BI project files. Who of you ever worked on BI projects by manually changing entries in the code? Yes, yeah, we are all BI developers here. I like that. And probably all of us failed at some point in time and broke something. The whole thing is not very trivial. Talking about analysis services, especially multidimensional, it's really bad. You know what I'm talking about. And probably all of you know what I'm talking about. Tabular is much easier. Still, it's a complex object model, but there are less interdependencies between the different objects. The model is cleaner because of the JSON-based technology, but still, it's very complex. And yeah, this complexity also leads to the issue that we don't have a real tool support in comparing, merging, or whatever. Still, there are exceptions for analysis services tabular. That is why I make this distinction in analysis services. But yeah, again, little support by standard tools. It's not only merging. Standard tools like MS Build don't support automated build for BI projects. You can build almost anything, but no BI projects. That's not possible. And who of you ever experienced a BI project where you got a set, let's say, where you got a set of requirements in the beginning, you started working on it, delivered a prototype, and everybody say, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. You are a lucky guy. Okay, but what I mostly experience is you know that this is almost never the case. You sit together with the guys, do a workshop, try to drag them into some kind of direction and tear any kind of information out of them. Write everything down, you do some drafts and whatever, and then you write the requirements down. They sign it, you do the prototype, and they say, this is almost completely not what I wanted. That's most of my experience. No, well, sometimes it's better, but... and apart from that, you have 4 weeks to do that prototype, or the second prototype. Well, that's what we discussed 4 weeks ago, but you don't know how many things changed in the meantime. We have to redo the complete thing. I never experienced a kind of project before, like BI projects, where you have such a high frequency of change requests. Requirements are changing for KPIs. Requirements are changing because your source systems are changing all of the time. You always have to perform changes. And if you write tests for this, you always have to adjust the tests. Because every new development, every change requires a new test. So this is a hell lot of work. Apart from that, talking about KPIs, normally as a BI developer, when you go to, or a BI consultant, when you go to a customer, you actually have to force them to actually align on one definition per KPI. Because in my experience, it's one KPI, 2 controllers, 3 different definitions. And that's like making them actually commit on one version of the KPI is another complexity, because that might lead to change requests again. Okay, so can we apply the best practices to SSAS based on the complexity of the project? So it's similar for other BI projects. This is just kind of, I chose SSAS because I'm most familiar with it, but there are very similar situations for other BI projects. With some of the tool support, I also mentioned support for SSIS. There are similar things for SSRS, so you can follow the same approach for all the other ones, but we will focus on SSAS. Maintaining a code repository, that's okay. Not with the full functionality, no merging, no comparing, but still maintaining a code repository and, well, doing the comparison on your own, but still that's possible. You're using SSDT as development tool. This supports integration of a lot of different source code repository tools, so that's okay. And as I mentioned already, it's highly recommendable. How do you build your BI projects nowadays? Do you have some kind of process, PowerShell scripts, or what are you doing? Are you actually building your projects intentionally? Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I was heading for. Thank you. The answer is, and that is also my experience, while in normal application development, build is the first thing you do. You do a lot of builds before you actually publish. With analysis services, it was like I was creating something, and in the end, I hit deploy. And the build was something which was done, but just as a part of the deploy. In most of the cases, the build doesn't have a big effect on what I'm doing, because if I get it, I'm sorry, I'm coming to you. The build actually is, in most of BI projects, not the issue. You get the error on other ways, not during the build. You already get it when you write some kind of functionality. A function doesn't work, you don't have to build it intentionally. Okay. Yes. Yes. I agree. I never experienced the build step to die. I experienced a lot of other freak behavior in SSDT. But you're absolutely right. The project is built in the background. There is a build functionality, and it's used all of the time. But we just don't do it on our own, and we actually don't think about automating it because, well, we don't really care. It's done automatically. What did you say? Okay, so the proposal is actually using the build to deliver more information about issues happening before you actually do the deployment. This is a good proposal, but this actually depends on what is part of the project, because the build actually covers what is really the content of the project. And the question is, for example, the server you want to deploy to, is this part of the project or is this configuration around the project? Because this is not part of the build process. But I understand what you're saying. So for everything which is part of the project, I want to have an information if that is valid when the build is actually finished. I agree on that. But yeah, that's definitely something which is interesting, but which means automating the build might be an issue or not. Probably it isn't, because the build is run all of the time. If the build could be improved is another topic, but a good one. But well, as the build is performed by SSDT, as it's run all the time, it doesn't give us any issues apart from when it's actually stuck. Well, probably it can get automated quite easily because it's not really influencing us much. And it's most of the time is pretty fast. Apart from reporting services projects with over 300 reports inside or something like that, which takes some time, but yeah, it's mostly fast. And build automation is a feature that is actually supported by CI/CD tools, as long as you have something which actually runs the build for you, but that is something where we will look into. So the next step actually is something which I covered with every commit to the baseline should be done, should be built. Every commit to the baseline should be built, and it should be approved, or it should be part of the commitment inside the team to commit to the baseline on a regular basis. If you're committing to the baseline every 4 weeks, maybe it's not that important to, well, it should be built, but it's not that helpful. So the best normal advice is to say at least once a day, the changes should be committed. There might be exceptions when you are working on a very complex piece of software or piece of implementation that might require a longer time, but the normal rule is once a day. And yeah, as we already talked about, it's not about merging different development versions into each other. I'm experiencing that with integration services. Different developers are working on different packages at the same time. Reporting services, of course, different reports. We actually even tried working in parallel on analysis services projects when you were aware of what you were actually changing that could work, but we tried to avoid this as much as possible. But still, even if you're working as a single developer, I'm coming to you just in a second, as a single developer, you should commit on a regular basis just to keep the advantages of getting informed about possible errors as soon as possible. You wanted to say? I will come to that on the next slide. Thank you so much. Merging analysis services multidimensional is not recommendable because there are so many interdependencies between the different objects of the object model. So for example, when you're changing a role, this can have effects on a cube and on a dimension. And if somebody else is working on those and they are checked out, for example, this can really lead to severe conflicts. With analysis services tabular, it's a completely different story. The object model is way cleaner, and tools like Tabular Editor or another tool I'm just mentioning here, which is BISM Normalizer, actually are supporting, and that is something which you will probably like, they're supporting a kind of schema comparison for, sorry? Perfect. And whoever works with analysis services tabular and doesn't know Tabular Editor or BISM Normalizer, look, well, you have the link for the one here. Tabular Editor is also for free. We can only recommend to use those tools as much as possible. They are way cleaner. They are offering a lot more possibilities of how to work. BISM Normalizer actually can be fully integrated into SSDT and can be run from there. You can use it on a command line basis, so you can actually define comparison, run a command line tool to actually run this, even get an incremental update statement out of the tool. So this is really something which improves the work with analysis services quite a lot. The next step, automated tests. We already had this topic. So automating existing tests, no challenge with that. If we have tests, CI/CD tools help us to automate the tests. But actually designing the tests is complex because of the complexity we have to face in the projects. There is the complexity in the system. There is a lot of things you actually have to test, a lot of change requirements. And when we're talking about integration tests, there is a whole large landscape with different technologies that you actually need to cover. And another thing is, again, the tool support. There are not too many tools actually supporting tests for BI projects, but this will also be part of another dedicated slide. And as I already mentioned, testing in a clone of production environment, it doesn't really depend if we're talking about the content, so the data, or if we're talking about the scaling of the environment. I don't know many cases where it's actually possible to have a test environment with the same scales as production, but you normally never have a development environment with the same scale. So you will actually need to work on your own to make this work, to actually make your whole development still deliver a feasible result, which can give you a preview of how this will behave in production. Even if things are running quickly in development, doesn't mean they also will run quickly in production, because this could be, you could probably think about this because the scales are much better in production, but the amount of data might be even much bigger, or there might be different kinds of errors, like other kind of data quality issues you might face. So this is something which you actually normally have to take care about. But if you really want to go for testing in a clone of production environment, that might get easier by using Azure environments, because this definitely helps you spinning up complete environments and makes it easier to actually spin them up and throw them away afterwards. which might be more, which might be cheaper than when you had to do the same thing on-prem. But this really depends on knowing what you do, because it might be more expensive as well. Okay. Make it easy to get the latest deliverables. That is pretty easy, because this is just a standard functionality of CI/CD projects, and automate the deployment is something we already talked about in the beginning. So it's very similar to automating the build. It's a standard functionality delivered by CI/CD tools, but you still have something that actually supports this. So the CI/CD tool is actually just performing the job that executes the release, but the actual command, the actual functionality needs to be delivered by something else, by a piece of software or a piece of command that actually supports this. And there are tools supporting this. So, for example, for analysis services, there always existed the analysis services deployment wizard, which also can be run from command line, which allowed you to do a full deployment of an analysis services multidimensional cube, for example. It always depends if you like that kind of approach, but at least there was something there which you could use. But for tabular, we could use BISM normalizer or tabular editor, for example. But it's not like there is a whole lot of different products actually supporting this like there is for normal software development. But actually automating the deployment is something which I think is one of the biggest time consumers or time savers that you could offer. Thinking about large analytical databases, well, the build is pretty fast. We talked about this. The deployment itself, bringing the metadata on the server, normally isn't taking that much time. It depends on the metadata, but processing the data inside, this could last quite long. So but you need this if you want to perform the data tests, the unit tests. So if you had an automated process that allows you to check in before you leave for home in the evening, and you come back and you see, well, the automation is done, the whole thing is deployed. Well, of course, if you're working on a server, you could start this before you leave, and the server will run it. But you can actually cover more of different situations by having a process that is doing this for you. This is something which you can do without continuous integration. It's not like this is the only solution. But as this is a normal approach in continuous integration, why not use it? Okay, so when we want to set up a continuous integration process for a BI project, what do we actually need? We try to make it a little bit like a recipe, like a cooking recipe. We need some ingredients, so we need our development tool where we create our project. If we don't have a project, we don't need CI. So the typical development tool for BI project is Visual Studio or SSDT. If you want, for example, to use the full testing functionality Microsoft is offering, you would need Visual Studio Enterprise with the BI projects added. But you can also develop the BI projects using SSDT. Talking about Tabular, you could also use Tabular Editor. You will need a source code repository. That is something which is more or less essential. In our case, we are choosing Azure DevOps with Git flavor, so you can still go for the old Team Foundation Services approach or SVC or something like that. But we decided for Git. And though it took me some time to get me to work with a new approach, Git probably is the approach that will be used most often in the future. So it might be recommendable to actually get used to working with that kind of process. If you want to apply and automate tests, and though this is the biggest piece of work and the biggest complexity in the whole thing, it is very recommendable because it is the best guarantee for stability and quality. You will need a testing framework. And there again, I just named some possibilities. There will be another slide which actually illustrates a little bit more what is available. You will need a build agent. We talked about that. So the piece of software that is actually running all the work. and you will need a DevOps framework. That is actually what I call CI/CD tool so far, because you will need something which is taking care of, this is my source code control, I have my projects in, somebody committed something, I need to run something, so I have my trigger, and where do I actually find it, where do I put it, what do I need to do, where are my pipelines? This is all part of the DevOps framework. And when we actually prepare our landscape, we need to configure this DevOps framework, of course, set up the build agent, register everything. We need, of course, to develop our project. That's something which is pretty obvious. And in this case, I added the preparation of unit tests as well. If you are using MS Build, well, I mentioned MS Build is not supporting BI projects. There again is an exception for analysis services tabular, because MS Build is supporting the build of analysis services tabular. If you're using MS Build, you probably want to use an additional file that is configuring or taking off your hands a lot of the configuration. So which kind of configuration from my configuration environment inside SSDT should be deployed where, with which variables, something like this. This all can be stored in the build project. You need to create the build pipeline, review the results, at least in the first place. If everything is running as you expected, then you should relate it to the source code events, which means you should set a trigger that says, when I commit something, run this build pipeline I just developed and tested on automatics. And the next step would be to create a release pipeline. And that is something which we want to look at a little bit at some demos. So what we need for this is tools. We already talked about, so the different kind of tools we can actually apply here is the DevOps framework, the CI/CD overall tool. We need tools to generate, design our tests. We need a tool to support the build and a tool to support the deployment. With CI/CD, there are several tools available. This is more like a general approach. So this is all of those are actually supporting different approaches. You will have more difficulties with the detailed actions. We decided for Azure DevOps, first of all, because we are very Microsoft related, and another very obvious reason, Azure DevOps allows you to create a test organization or a small organization for up to 5 developers working on this for free. So if you want to get started with this, it's actually a very good approach because you get all the functionalities. You don't have to pay until you get more than 5 people. And a lot of BI projects I know, or a lot of BI teams I know, are not larger than that. Of course, there are a lot of large BI projects or BI teams. I don't want to actually put this into question, but there are a lot of small BI teams that actually work on a single project, and they could be a good starting point. The next thing is test generation. I quickly want to show you some of this. If you're looking at database projects, which in my opinion are also part of the BI landscape, there are tools available like, and there is an X inside. I didn't want to place there, so it's not a SQL unit X. When you're looking at the last one, it's SQL unit. But the most commonly used or most popular tool is actually T-SQL-T, which is available for free. If you don't like to do so much configuration on your own, Redgate is offering a framework around T-SQL-T, which actually offers some kind of front end that allows you to more work on a wizard basis. And when you're looking for test generation tools for BI projects, and I have a typo in there as well, I'm sorry about that. First of all, the most common tool is NBI. NBI is a testing framework which is based on the general available testing framework NUnit, but which offers support for BI tools. And that means for all common Microsoft BI tools plus Power BI. At the moment, only for Power BI Desktop. That means you have to have your Power BI Desktop open. But let's be honest, if we're talking about creating a pipeline where we can define each step we have to do, opening up a Power BI desktop file using command line shouldn't be the biggest issue. So, but at least you can have the possibility to test all common BI projects. And here again, we have, so NBI is available for free, which means you don't have to pay anything, but you have to do more on your own because it's not offering the kind of comfort that most of the paid tools actually do. But SentryOne is also offering a testing tool for BI projects called SentryOne Test. And this is also based on NUnit, or allows to design tests based on NUnit, but also on the newer version 3 of NUnit or on MS Test, another very typical testing framework. And well, I quickly want to show you how this looks like if you want to create tests in NBI or in SentryOne Test. So what I did here is I actually created a typical solution containing an analysis services tabular project and actually a C# class library, which contains my testing project. With NBI, it's relatively easy. There is a very, very good description or documentation of how to actually set this up on the web. I had an issue with one path that was defined in the deployment configuration. Talking about a path, before I got to this arrow, there is a bootstrapper for NBI, which you can just run, for example, by using NuGet and installing the complete package via command line, which completely creates this project that you are seeing here. So you don't have to create anything on your own. And the result that you're getting after you run the bootstrapper and maybe adjusted the path in the deployment configuration. I will check this out another time. It just happened to me yesterday when I did this again. If this is actually happening again, I will report this back and hopefully this will be fixed. But what you can do after you created this, and you can create this class library on your own, it doesn't need to be in another project, actually is you'll get a front end that allows you to work at least with the run of the test, see the results of the test, do some additional configuration on the project. So this is also actually offering you an additional front end as well. But this is only for the execution of the tests, more or less. The tests itself, you still need to define on your own manually. And again, this is XML based. So what you're actually doing is you're setting up this kind of NBit files, which contains information about a complete suite of tests. And inside this NBit file, you can actually define your own tests. So in this case, I decided to do a very simple test, but a test that makes sense in the combination of analysis services environment. So I created a test query, against my relational data warehouse, and I created another test query, a DAX query, against my analysis services tabular model, which should deliver the same result. I set up the test, and when you're looking at the result, in this case, of course, I made it work. I could show you when I changed something in the DAX query that it would fail. But I hope that you believe that the test framework is actually doing what it should. So actually, after you set this up, setting up is not that complicated. After you set this up, running the whole thing is pretty easy. Designing the test, of course, requires that you get familiar with the constructs in XML that you actually could use. Of course, when you're doing this properly, you don't put the connection string inside the XML tag, but you will use additional things. But also for all of this, there is a very detailed documentation on the web how to actually apply variables, filters, and so on. This is all there, but you have to do it on your own. In comparison with SentryOne Test, you need to pay for it, but you get a lot more comfort by this. So SentryOne Test, when you're looking at the project, is actually looking relatively similar. It's also a C# library. where you can define test groups similar to the test suites. But what you get here is you get a front end and you get an overview, which actually helps you to do the whole thing. Sentry1 is running with this Visual Studio integration. It's also offering a web client that you can use, and you can also integrate into test integration, which will allow you to see the results on a website, something like that. And creating a test is relatively easy because you can just assert a test. There are templates for certain tests already, which will take the most of the work off you, but you can also just create a test. And my tip is start by defining the assertion. So start by defining what the actual result should be. So by doing this, you can look into the toolbox, just a very, very quick demo. And I need to zoom out again to open the toolbox. And because I closed this down, I always have to reopen the Sentry1 toolbox. I'm sorry about that. So when you click in assertion, you get presented all the assertions you have. So a typical case, what you would do with analysis services is a grid comparison. You add this, and then you have the possibility to actually edit this by providing connection strings or connection strings already available in your project, queries, and so on. And when you filled in this one dialog, all the objects you saw in the other tests are actually created automatically, so you don't have to do anything else. It's delivering the same kind of results, but actually it's much more comfortable. It depends on if you want to pay for that comfort or not, but it's really helpful. But NBI is doing a great job, so it depends. Yes. I actually provided the same test here. In this case, I actually wrote the queries inside. So this is a very simple DAX statement, just calculating sales in units per customer. I can also zoom in. I'm very sorry. Better? That's possible. You can apply parameters to this as well. Parameters, filters, you can define it on a configuration, can pass it over. You can actually use parameters from outside, inside the build environment, so you can actually configure this from outside, which leads me to the build pipeline, and this is definitely some, oh, no, I still have 30 minutes. I just thought the session is over. I'm very sorry. I definitely want to show you the build pipeline. So defining the tests is actually relatively easy. The question is how to actually include the tests in the build pipeline. In this case, I decided for actually keeping both projects inside and building both projects inside my build pipeline and then running the tests at the end. This, of course, is a test definition which doesn't make any kind of sense after the build. Because what do I want with an AS database file? I need an actually deployed analysis services database with process data to actually run this kind of test. But of course, there are other tests that could be run after the build, or you actually have to decide in this combination to run the unit tests after the deployment. But just to mention, it really doesn't make a difference on how to design the test. This is still the result you need to have and still the unit test you have to define. Okay, so creating tests is the one thing. I just summarized quickly up about the two tools that I actually showed to you. But the next step is actually creating the build pipeline. So maybe once again, going back to my solution, what I did here is I actually integrated my whole solution into a Git project. So when I'm going to the Team Explorer, you can see that the whole thing is included in my continuous intelligence Git project running in Azure DevOps. And what I can do here, of course, is I can manage my changes. I can commit something. I can push my changes to my source code repository. And well, my source code repository, in this case being Azure DevOps, also allows me to use the same tool as my DevOps framework. And that is what I want to do right now. So I'm looking into Azure DevOps. This is actually my organization that I created, which is called just Continuous Intelligence. At the moment, I have two very basic projects inside. What we are looking into is the CI/CD demos project. Here, you will find all the different terms we talked about. So you will have the source code repositories. There you can find, for example, the project that contains the SentryOne test integration. We have another repository that contains the NBI project. So if we are switching to the analysis, so AdventureWorks tabular NBI project, or the CI/CD demos repository that, for example, contains just in analysis services and multidimensional projects, which I used in the beginning just to test the build and the deployment of analysis services. You can manage everything here. Here you also have an artifact repository included. At this point in time, I didn't actually have to use the artifact repository. As I mentioned, this is not necessarily required for your BI project, but I actually, the option is there if you want to. You can use it for different ways. You can use it, for example, for your build artifacts, but you can also use it, which might be quite interesting, when you are using references like NBI framework or SentryOne framework, to ensure that there is the that you use this to guarantee that the same version of this framework is used throughout the company. So you can create a feed that actually contains all the packages, all the assemblies that are used inside your projects. And then you can just deploy changes, new versions to this artifact repository. And this actually notifies everybody who is working, who is consuming this feed. And this can help you to ensure that the same version of tools or assemblies are actually used throughout your organization. You can design test plans, applying the test that we use, but the things we actually want to look in right now is the pipelines. So a build pipeline can be created relatively easy. So what we're doing here, I'm just showing you the build pipelines are created in a development language called YAML, which is, I can show you in the screenshot in the tabs. Which is this one. It's relatively easy to read, but of course it would be another language you need to get used to and understand the objects and principles to write it. But luckily, the front end still offers the option to switch to the classic editor, to a wizard-based creation of the pipelines, which makes it easier to get started. So again, I'm looking for a repository where I want to get my source code from. And then I'm just starting with an empty job. As you can see, there is a lot of actually templates for different frameworks, for different project types. Unfortunately, no template for BI projects. So you definitely have to start with an empty job. There is no other way. And inside this empty job, you actually can create, I will leave the names right now and concentrate on creating the build pipeline. Of course, naming conventions and good naming is very important. What you see here first is the agent pool. Here you can actually decide if you want to use an agent that is actually provided in Azure, so just something like an Azure VM in the background, or you can actually register your own agents. You can use self-defined, self-hosted agents, which you can just actually define here and use here. You can create your own agent pools and apply agents to this. This is something which we did for BI projects. The reason is, when running the agent software itself is something which is always the same. But on the VM that you are actually using to run, used to running the agent, you might need additional software, additional prerequisites that allows you to actually run the project. So if, for example, MS Build is not supported, what is the case for integration services, reporting services, analysis services, multidimensional, you probably need to install another software that allows you to actually build the project. What might be the most common software used to run automated builds, or I don't know if it's the most used, but the most obvious software to run builds on BI projects? Any idea? Yes, it's SSDT, exactly. It's devenv-exe, because Visual Studio or SSDT, which you actually can install without any additional license, allows you to run builds using command line. So that is something which you can easily include into your build job. But that means that SSDT needs to be installed on the machine where the agent is actually running. So that is a reason why for BI projects, it probably makes sense to use self-hosted build agents, at least for the building. And that is what we did here as well. So going back, I'm switching to my locally hosted agent. And then I can just create my agent job. Here again, I could switch to another agent pool. Why should I do this? I can run several jobs inside my pipeline. If I'm running several jobs in parallel, I need several agents. If I only need one self-hosted agent for a job and all the other ones can run on Azure-hosted agents, well, let's change this depending on what I actually need and to actually get the most out of it. In this case, we keep it. And there is a lot of properties you can set. It runs without changing any of them. If you're interested, we can definitely discuss more of them after the session. But what you need to do next is you can add tasks. And in Visual Studio Marketplace, there are predefined tasks that help you to build or deploy BI projects. So you can look for them, install them easily, and use them. But what you can do as well, especially for the building, if you are running Visual Studio on the build server, you can just use a PowerShell script where you, and I prepared a PowerShell command just to avoid writing something wrong, where you can just put a PowerShell command inside your step. In this case, I am building an analysis services tabular project, which allows me to actually use MS Build Exe. If I want to run this with analysis services multidimensional, I would use a very similar command that actually uses devenv-exe, so SSDT. And you have a lot of already built-in parameters that you can pass over that actually helps you define where the code is actually gathered from, where you can put it to. And this actually would be sufficient to already build my project. Just to run this quickly, you can easily see that this will work. And as we are running out of time, I will stop creating the new one and just want to show you after the run of the build how you could set up a complete pipeline starting with a build, going for release and enabling a trigger just to run this once. If you're interested, it actually doesn't make sense to send you the complete YAML files because, of course, there's a lot of private information in. But if you're interested send me an email and I can try to provide this as compact as possible or just sending this out. There is also screenshots of what I did. But you see, we already created this kind of build. On the agent, you will already see the build result inside your working directory. And if we're, bless you, and if we are going back to the already existing build pipelines, you will see that I created one just this afternoon to make sure that everything is still working. I'm a little bit of paranoid there. And I did exactly what we did just now, used the PowerShell task to actually run the build. And if you want to use it as the baseline for a release pipeline, you actually need to apply one other step. You need to publish the artifact. And here you can decide if you want to publish the artifact into a working directory, inside your agent, or into a file share. And this, for example, also allows you to publish the artifacts into your artifact repository, if that is what you actually want to use to store your artifacts. So this actually runs completely and creates the build, publishes the artifact. After you tested this and see that this runs, the next step would be to say, I want to automate this. I want this to run each and every time when I commit something. And this is very easy because there is a tab called triggers. And the only thing you need to do is check the enable continuous integration part. Azure DevOps is doing all the rest for you. And of course, you have more possibilities to actually configure this, but that's more or less everything you need to get started. So, and we will just perform a quick test of this in a moment. But the last thing you actually need to do is when you want to create, oh, I'm sorry, I have to go back into this for a quick moment. When you performed a build, when you run the complete build pipeline, you will see, first of all, a button where you can see the artifacts. You can look at the artifacts, or you can push this button release, which will actually start the creation of a new release pipeline for you. So this will start the release pipeline already showing to the place where you stored your artifacts out of this build. And I just create a new one. And this is now actually jumping into my release pipeline because I already pre-created it. I should have created a new one. But this is leading to the release pipeline, which is actually looking quite similar to what we just saw. You are getting the artifacts, the results from your build, and then you have the possibility to actually define one or different stages like dev, test, production, whatever. You can set constraints that might be required to get to a certain environment. So for example, you can say, I want to go to dev directly, then I want to run my tests. If they pass, go to QA, but before I go to production, I need an approval step inside. This is all possible to configure it herein. And inside the environment, you actually just add tasks that go for the deployment. And with the deployment, I can only recommend to look at Visual Studio Marketplace, which is automatically integrated, because there are already deployment tasks for BI projects, even for Power BI. So there are tasks that allow you to actually deploy Power BI desktop files to the service. So that would be something which definitely would be worth looking into. And as I'm running out of time, I'm just quickly just do a small change. I will just rename something in the configuration. So for example, if you go to the project properties and just do a quick change, this is a demo I do at PaaS Summit. So my project will be named like this. Now I can check in my changes. Commit. Config. Commit all. Yes, I want to save. And then I just have to push my changes to the system. And just before I go back to the slides for the last slide, to already show you that this is having some effect when you're going back to your pipelines, you see that already a build got started on automatics by Azure DevOps because I did all this. And while this is running in the background, let's just get back. So summary, where's my Power BI slide? I missed my Power BI slide. I will upload another version to the, I'm sorry. About Power BI, at Ignite, it was actually finally released or finally announced that there will be a development or deployment pipeline approach in Power BI servers coming in the next few months. I'm sorry, it will take some time, but look at the video from Ignite. I actually put the link, there it is, okay, after the recipe, which actually allows you to to at least run through dev, test, and production inside the service. That doesn't help you to bring the Power BI desktop into the service in the first way. That is still something you might need to develop with Azure DevOps. Source code control is not really supported yet, so you can only actually save or store the complete PBIX or PBID files. That might be something to think about, so storing the template without the data. But they are working on it, and there are things to happen. My resume, well, there are a lot of challenges for continuous integration in BI. The tools, the support is getting better. Azure DevOps actually allows a lot of us to provide solutions that can be used by others. This makes the whole process easier. But let's be honest, it's still a lot of work, especially the testing part. This is something which the running of the tests can be automated, the generation. I would be happy to have a test generator automation, I don't know, but I don't know any. But it's possible to do this. It's a lot of work. The question is, how important is it to do this? Probably it's the best to actually get started with that when you start with a new project. It's always easier to start afresh. But the stability of your development should be worth the effort. And that's actually the situation. And just to see my build run, and when I'm looking at my deployment pipeline, I see that again, when I'm looking at the time, a release of the deployment also has taken place in the background while we were just talking. So at least the whole process from building the project after the commit until deploying the database without processing at the moment, but at least deploying the database to an Azure Analysis Services has run in the background while we were talking. I'm sorry to have been a little bit over time. Thanks for your time. It was a pleasure. I will send out a tweet when the slides are available. Thanks so much, and have a good time.